That is why accelerationism is not just another political belief. It is an attack on the basic promise of civilization. A nation is built on the idea that strangers can live together under laws, institutions, duties, and shared systems. The power grid is a symbol of that promise. It works because countless people who will never meet still cooperate. Engineers design it, workers repair it, regulators inspect it. Communities depend on it. Citizens pay for it. When the lights come on, it is proof that shared life is still possible. Accelerationists hate that proof. They want Americans to stop believing in one another. They want the country to feel ungovernable. They want despair to become normal. This is why the threat matters especially to Americans who remember what national strength used to mean. Strength was not only about weapons, it was about the ability to build, to maintain, to repair, to organize, to protect, to keep faith with the next generation. The highways, bridges, dams, power plants, ports, military bases, farms, factories, and neighborhoods of America were not created by people who worshipped collapse. They were created by people who believed the future could be made better through work. That is the tradition accelerationists betray. They may borrow patriotic language, but they do not serve the nation. They target the systems that keep Americans alive. A true patriot can criticize the government. A true patriot can protest, expose corruption, demand reform, defend constitutional rights, and argue fiercely about the direction of the country. That is part of the American tradition. But a patriot does not dream of hospitals going dark. A patriot does not try to freeze families in winter. A patriot does not celebrate panic in American cities. A patriot does not mistake sabotage against civilians for courage. The line is clear. Dissent wants the country to become better. Accelerationism wants the country to break. The challenge for America is serious, because protecting an open society is never simple. The United States is enormous. Its infrastructure stretches across cities, deserts, mountains, forests, rural counties, and coastlines. Some facilities can be heavily protected. Others are remote, exposed, and difficult to guard. If every piece of infrastructure were protected like a military base, the cost would be enormous and daily life would become more restricted. But doing nothing is not an option either. The country has to find a way to protect critical systems without surrendering the freedom and openness that make America worth defending. That means understanding the threat without panicking. Not every blackout is terrorism. Not every act of vandalism is part of an ideology. Not every angry person online becomes violent. A free country must be careful with labels because broad fear can damage civil liberties. But a free country must also be honest. Violent extremist ideologies are real. Online radicalization is real. Domestic threats to infrastructure are real. The answer is not hysteria. The answer is vigilance, preparation, strong communities, serious law enforcement, better security, and a culture that reaches isolated people before hate movements recruit them. America has faced enemies before. It faced fascism overseas. It faced the Cold War. It faced terrorism, economic crisis, natural disasters, and deep internal division. But accelerationism is different because it tries to make America destroy itself from within. It does not need to defeat the US military. It needs Americans to lose trust in one another. It needs people to believe that the system cannot be repaired, that neighbors are enemies, and that violence is the only force left in history. That is why this ideology must be understood not as a curiosity, but as a warning. The accelerationist looks at a city full of lights and dreams of darkness. But the better American tradition looks at darkness and asks how to bring the lights back on. That is the difference between collapse and civilization, between hatred and duty, between destruction and national purpose. America was not built by people who believed the future should be destroyed. It was built by people who believed the future could be defended. And if accelerationists believe America must fall, then America's answer must be simple, firm, and clear. The lights stay on. One of the most disturbing examples came from Maryland, where federal prosecutors described a plot to attack electrical substations around Baltimore. The names connected to that case were Sarah Beth Clendaniel and Brandon Russell. Russell was known as the founder of Atomwaffen Division. a neo-Nazi group tied to violent extremist ideology. The alleged goal was not random vandalism. It was not anger at one building or one company. It was part of a broader fantasy of social breakdown, a belief that attacking infrastructure could help accelerate chaos inside the United States. Baltimore, in that vision, was not seen as a city full of people. It was seen as a pressure point, and that is the moral sickness at the heart of accelerationism. Its believers talk about systems, collapse, and the grid, but the people who suffer are not abstract. They are nurses trying to finish a shift. They are elderly couples depending on heat. They are parents trying to keep their children calm. They are small business owners watching everything they built become vulnerable in one night. They are police, firefighters, dispatchers, doctors, and utility workers suddenly forced into emergency mode because someone decided that the suffering of strangers was useful. Accelerationists imagine themselves as warriors, but their real victims are ordinary Americans who never volunteered to be part of their fantasy. The warning became even more real after attacks on electrical substations in Moore County, North Carolina, left tens of thousands of people without power for days. Schools closed, businesses were disrupted, emergency measures were put in place, families were forced to live through a sudden reminder that the systems surrounding them were not invincible. The exact motive in that case was not publicly resolved in the same way as other extremist plots, but the lesson was impossible to ignore. A local attack against infrastructure could create fear, economic damage, and public disruption across an entire community. For extremist spaces online, incidents like that can become fuel. They watch the news, they study the reaction, they look at fear and call it proof. They look at disruption and call it inspiration. This does not mean every attack has the same ideology or the same motive. But in the online world of violent extremism, examples travel fast. A headline can become a myth. A criminal case can become propaganda. A failure can become a lesson. And because modern radicalization no longer needs a single leader standing in front of a crowd, dangerous ideas can spread through encrypted chats, memes, videos, forums, and private communities where isolated people are slowly trained to see destruction as purpose. In earlier generations, extremist movements often needed meetings, printed material, local chapters, and face-to-face recruitment. Today, a person can be radicalized alone in a bedroom. It may begin with resentment, loneliness, humiliation, or anger. Then come the jokes, the coded language, the conspiracy theories, the edited videos, the fake history, and the promise that someone who feels powerless can become important through violence. That is one of the most dangerous parts of accelerationism. It gives lost people a story. It tells them the world is already doomed. It tells them mercy is weakness. It tells them ordinary people are not neighbors, but obstacles. And finally, it tells them destruction can make them historic. That is how moral collapse happens before physical collapse. Before someone can justify hurting a community, he has to stop seeing that community as human. Before someone can celebrate a blackout, he has to stop thinking about the grandmother on medical equipment, the family in the freezing house, the emergency room under pressure, or the worker who cannot afford another lost paycheck. Accelerationism does not only attack infrastructure, it attacks empathy. It teaches people to look at suffering and see opportunity. It teaches them to mistake cruelty for strength. And once that happens, the person has already stepped outside the basic moral agreement that allows a country to function. But the fantasy of collapse is a lie. Collapse does not create greatness. It does not create honor. It does not create a stronger America. Collapse hurts the vulnerable first. The elderly suffer first. The sick suffer first. The poor suffer first. Families without money, transportation, backup power, or safe housing suffer first. The people who dream about collapse imagine themselves standing tall in the ruins. But real ruins are not cinematic. They are cold, hungry, dirty, violent, and full of innocent people paying the price for someone else's ideology. There is nothing heroic about wishing that on your own country. America did not become the most powerful nation on earth by accident. It crossed oceans, built cities out of wilderness, raised factories that armed the free world, defeated fascism in Europe, stared down the Soviet Union, put men on the moon, and wired an entire continent with power so reliable that most citizens forgot to marvel at it. Every night from New York to Texas, from the farms of Iowa to the mountains of Montana, millions of American homes glow because generations of engineers, workers, linemen, soldiers, builders, and ordinary taxpayers created one of the greatest systems of modern civilization, the American power grid. It is not as dramatic as a battleship, not as visible as a fighter jet, and not as symbolic as the flag over Iwo Jima, but it is one of the reasons America works. It keeps hospitals alive, it keeps food cold, it keeps families warm, it keeps traffic moving, businesses open, phones charged, water pumping, and emergency services connected. It is the invisible bloodstream of the Republic. And that is exactly why America's enemies, foreign and domestic, have learned to look at it with hungry eyes. Because the strength of a great nation is not only measured by what it can destroy, but by what it can keep running. A country that can light its cities, fuel its industries, protect its people, and recover from disasters is a country that still believes in tomorrow. But hidden in the darker corners of the internet, a new kind of extremist began to dream of the opposite. Not victory through elections, not change through debate, not reform through law. They dreamed of blackout, panic, collapse, and civil disorder. They believed that if the systems holding America together could be broken, then society itself could be pushed over the edge. This ideology has a name. It is called accelerationism. Accelerationism, in its most dangerous form, is the belief that society is already too broken to repair, and that extremists should help destroy it faster. These people do not think like ordinary political movements. They are not trying to win over voters at a town hall. They are not trying to persuade Congress, organize a legal campaign, or build a better future through public trust. They believe the system must be shocked, weakened, and driven into chaos. In far-right and neo-Nazi circles, this idea becomes especially poisonous. Their fantasy is that if America falls into enough fear, enough racial tension, enough economic instability, and enough violence, then a new authoritarian order can rise from the ruins. In their minds, collapse is not a tragedy. It is a doorway. But this is not patriotism. It is not courage. It is not revolution in the proud American sense. It is a death cult wearing the mask of strategy. America's greatest rebels built something after they resisted. The founders built a republic. Abolitionists expanded the meaning of freedom. Civil rights leaders forced the country to live closer to its own promises. Soldiers fought to defend the nation from enemies who wanted tyranny. But accelerationists do not want to improve America. They want to break it. They look at a country of families, veterans, workers, children, churches, schools, hospitals, and neighborhoods, and they see only a machine they want to push into failure. To understand the danger, you have to understand how fragile normal life can become once electricity disappears. A blackout is not just a dark room and a candle on the kitchen table. A blackout can mean oxygen machines stop working. Elderly people lose heat in winter, hospitals move to emergency power, traffic lights go dead, businesses lose thousands of dollars in food and inventory, water systems face pressure, families lose communication, and entire communities suddenly realize how dependent they are on infrastructure they rarely think about. Modern life feels permanent until the power goes out. Then, very quickly, people remember that civilization is not magic. It is maintenance, engineering, trust, and cooperation. That is why extremists focus on infrastructure. They know they do not need to defeat the United States military. They do not need tanks in the streets or a foreign army landing on American shores. Their goal is psychological. They want people to feel unsafe in their own towns. They want citizens to look at the government and ask why it cannot protect them. They want ordinary Americans to distrust institutions, distrust neighbors, and believe collapse is already beginning. In other words, the target is not only the electrical equipment. The real target is confidence. The real target is the invisible belief that tomorrow morning the lights will still come on.